Build 42 is the next major update for Project Zomboid, and whilst we are expecting it to drop this year, it's been a long journey, and I think it's fair to say that many players are feeling mixed emotions in regards to how long it's taken, the Indie Stone's approach to the update, and the communication we've received along the way. So, in this video, I figured it was about time I discussed the elephant in the room. We'll talk details about the development of Build 42, how long it's taken, and more importantly, why, provide some context on what we can expect coming up to release based on previous content updates, and lastly, share some of my personal thoughts and feelings with you folks at home on the whole situation. Most importantly, I'd really like to hear from you guys on what you think in the comments on this one. Remember, this is a positive discussion, and it's important for us all to be involved, but equally, I will ask that everyone tries to keep a level head. Like and subscribe for more videos just like this one. Let's get into it. First things first, let's have a brief recap of what we know about Build 42's likely time frame for release thus far, and I wanted to start with this because I actually have a bit of an apology to make, and I think there's going to be a lot of people that were just as confused as I was when making my mistake. So back in December of 2023, the lead developer behind Project Zomboid, Lemmy, responded to a Reddit thread by stating the unstable build was planned for the first half of 2024. No further announcements were made on other platforms. It was just the singular response, and it quickly spread through the community via word of mouth. Still, to this day, a lot of people think that this is the current target for release, and this is where things get a bit confusing and where my mistake was made. In January of 2024, the Indie Stone's Twitter then posted that Build 42 would be quote-unquote out in 2024. Again, this was not posted on any other platforms outside of their Twitter, and the news was spread via word of mouth once more. Now, what I didn't realize in reading this post was that the tweet was referring to the unstable build, whereas I misinterpreted this as the devs saying the full version would be out in 2024 and the unstable branch was still planned for the first half of the year. As a result of this, I've been telling you guys for several months now that Build 42 was going to be out in the first half of the year, when in actuality, that's not been the updated statement for quite some time. So why am I talking about this? Well, first of all, I need to apologize. It's my responsibility as a content creator primarily focused on news, tips, and guides to ensure that I get this information right. And in this case, I made a pretty big error. I made an assumption, which I should know better than to do in my line of work. Now, I accept my part in the confusion that's been caused, and all I can really say is that I'm sorry to have exacerbated the issue, and I don't take the mistake I made lightly. Now, the second reason I wanted to talk about this was because I do believe there's also an element of responsibility to be placed on the development team for how they handled their communication with these posts. The Indie Stone has always made a pretty big deal out of not giving release dates or timeframes until very, very close to the time they're ready to release. With that in mind, what I found particularly peculiar about how this situation was handled was that the community were essentially left to disseminate this information themselves. I mean, Lemmy's comment was in a reply to a Reddit thread. It wasn't announced on their Discord or their social platforms. It wasn't even mentioned in the Thursdoid to the best of my knowledge, and that's just a little bit odd. What's even more strange is that this then occurred again when the developers gave their statement on Twitter via their official account. There was no Discord announcement, no mention in the Thursdoid, and as a result, the community has been on two different pages this whole time. Up until a few weeks ago, even I thought the update was due in the first half of the year, and unfortunately, that's just not the case. So if you were in the same boat as me, I'm really sorry if I had a part to play in that for you, and hopefully now you know where you stand. Now, could it have been handled better by the developers? Yes, absolutely. When you have a community as large as Project Zomboid and you give a statement with a release timeframe or date, it needs to be a full announcement. Leaving your player base to chase updates in any other manner is simply going to result in misinformation and confusion as a result of poor communication and information dissemination. For a development team that has historically been incredibly transparent, this just felt like they dropped the ball on this one. And I say that as a huge supporter of theirs. Okay, so with that out of the way and hopefully everybody being on the same page now, the question remains, when are we likely to hear a solid release date for Build 42? Now, I don't think it's likely to be soon unless they really surprise us. We've already been told Build 42 is not imminent in the last Thursdoid, and that we're going to hear a more accurate timeline at the end of June in the next Thursdoid, but I highly doubt it's a date, and that's just based on how the developers have handled the multiplayer update for Build 41. Even up to a week before its release, we didn't have an exact date, more just an estimate of when to expect the update. With that in mind, I'd say we won't have a tight time frame estimate until about a month or so before, which again was roughly what happened with Build 41's multiplayer update, so that's backed up by the practices the developers have exhibited in the past. Now that's not to say it's a certainty, but it's at least based on their previous actions rather than pure speculation. This leads me nicely into something that I think is highly contested by the community, certainly going by my comments section. There's two polar opposite sides when asking the question, is the wait for Build 42 acceptable? Well, frankly, that's something we could debate all day and is purely opinion based, but it's certainly nothing out of the ordinary for Project Zomboid. There were 3 years between Build 40 and Build 41, which was a major update for the game that fundamentally changed a whole host of mechanics, not least the massive graphical upgrade that was a complete night and day change to the previous graphics the game had. It's been about 2.5 years since Build 41's multiplayer update, so again, it's nothing new in that sense, and there's no reason to believe that we won't get this update, which is something I see quite often, people speculating that it's all just some sort of myth which is just completely unfounded, and you only have to look back at public version history of the game itself to see that. Now, if you do decide to take a look at the version history, you'll see that before Build 41, updates were more frequent and contained significantly less features. There are essentially two options with development. Either you release updates often with less content, or less often with more content. Build 41 was the update where the Indie Stone decided to change tact and release a much larger amount of stuff, but of course, it took much longer to make. It saw the biggest influx of players Project Zomboid has ever had, and it's largely down to the fact the game changed so much. To put this in perspective, Project Zomboid's highest peak player count in a month before Build 41's multiplayer update was just over 8,500 players. When this update came along, that skyrocketed to a record peak of over 50,000 players, and that was immediately beaten by the following month at 65,000 players. Since then, the lowest the peak player count has been is 21,000 players. All of this to say that releasing large amounts of content in one go has proven effective for the developers of Project Zomboid, and whilst I know a lot of people would probably prefer to see smaller patches drip-fed every month or two, the reality is that it is very, very unlikely to happen again after such a massive success with the alternative. I get a bunch of comments on YouTube all the time asking why the developers don't opt to release smaller updates, and hopefully now you know why. The statistics speak for themselves, and come Build 42, we can probably expect another huge influx of players as a result of this approach. Now, understandably, this method can leave players feeling frustrated at the wait between updates. However, consider the alternative. Say we're given content every couple of months, but it's limited to a couple of features at a time. As a result, we'll be done with that new stuff faster, mods will be made incompatible and require updating more frequently, and we'll naturally lose interest again before waiting for the next content drop. Really, we face the same outcome either way. Eventually, we get bored, and there's not much we can do about that. It is a fact of game development that we need to accept when playing the same game consistently, especially if it's not a game with a AAA size development team behind it. The only difference in the approach that's currently taken is that we have a longer wait, more features to play with, and we see larger amounts of new players and returning players coming back to the game at once. Whilst we're on the topic of development strategy, I do want to dispel a couple of regular comments I get on my videos that I think span from a lack of understanding of how game development works. The biggest one being, why don't the devs just focus on X feature instead of all these other things? And for Project Zomboid, that's quite often NPCs, and who could blame you? It's the feature that everyone is waiting to see. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have probably seen me responding to these comments in the past, but to sum it up, focusing on one singular particular element is just not how development works, and I'll explain why. Each developer has a different skill set. For example, a map designer is specialized in creating environments. A programmer, on the other hand, might be focused more on the development of AI. Said map designer is unlikely to possess the skills needed to create complex AI, and on a similar token, the programmer is unlikely to be able to achieve the same levels of detail in map design work. This is a very crude and basic example, but in essence, everyone on a development team has a specific role, and asking them to work on something outside of their wheelhouse will mean poor results or no results at all. Instead, everything progresses in tandem with one another. Every element is being worked on adjacently, and it's not a case of one particular area being left on the sidelines. It's also important for me to mention that just because we don't see something in Thursdoids doesn't mean it isn't being developed. This is something that the devs have clarified themselves more than once in the past, in fact, and I can understand why. It's easy to think that NPCs being the biggest thing most of the player base wants, but also not being in the next major build, is something that just isn't being worked on since we don't hear much about it. And whilst it's understandable to think that, it is factually incorrect. The truth is that the developers behind Project Zomboid simply choose to show us more of what's coming in the build that's up next, not the one after it. Things could change before then, multiple times in fact, so it makes far more sense to show us things that are closer to completion and are less likely to undergo reworks before they reach us in a few years' time, for example. Otherwise, you end up with a bunch of confusion as to how certain features are actually going to work, what's going to make it into the next version, and just general misinformation, which is already pretty rife in the Project Zomboid community at the best of times. Okay, so the last myth I want to bust in this one is related to mods. Mods have become a massive part of Project Zomboid's success, and I'd be willing to bet that the majority of the player base uses at least some of them in their playthroughs to make their games that little bit better. Now, historically, major updates can cause incompatibilities with mods, and as a result, they need to be patched, fixed, significantly reworked, or entirely remade in some cases. One of the biggest things I see bandied around all the time in various community channels is that Build 42 is somehow going to result in the death of modding, and that every single mod ever is just going to be broken and then left to rot. Now, there is an element of truth to this. Some mods will break. How many, we can't really say, but it's not going to be all of them, and those that are broken are likely to be fixed. The ones that don't get fixed are going to be the ones that haven't been updated for a considerable amount of time anyway. A very small number of those mods will be smaller quality of life functions that haven't needed updates, but the majority will have been left a long time ago and aren't being worked on by the modders. The great thing about this is that the mods that matter will be fixed, and I'd imagine that it will be fairly prompt too, with most being within a month or two at most, because it's in the modders' best interest to get them working so that their mod can continue to be used and gain popularity. That very small number of mods that don't get fixed and are still widely used by the community, you can guarantee there will be someone that comes out with another version. There's also people like myself out there that commission mods for the community, and that means we essentially pay a modder to make mods we want to see. I can tell you right now that if a mod is broken and it's important to a large number of people, those individuals that commission mods, myself included, will come out of the woodwork and will be willing to get those back on the workshop in some capacity. So no, modding won't be dead the moment Build 42 drops. There will be a period of time in which it may be best to run vanilla for a while, but it will quickly get back to normal and we'll all be using mod lists that are hundreds of mods long again in no time. So I guess that leaves me to round up this discussion with where I stand overall and a bit of a summary statement on the wait for Build 42 and how it's affected the players at home. We're all a bit frustrated, myself included. The wait has been long, although it's nothing new. Really, we should have expected this kind of wait between updates, and it does make sense as to why it's been so long when we look back at the context and the approach of the developers regarding larger content drops over a less frequent period. Now, my personal frustration stems from the confusion caused by poor communication around the release of Build 42, not the wait itself. I'm hopeful that the update is going to bring an influx of players to the game, both new and old, and I don't see any reason why the update won't land. The only thing that potentially worries me now is whether there's going to be another delay. Recently, we were told that the crafting system we'd heard about for a long time coming to Build 42 wasn't going to be making it in its entirety, like we expected, and that instead the team was going to start consolidating and polishing up what was already finished, ready for release. My concern now is that this decision may have been made too late, and that is purely speculation because nobody can really say for sure. Even the devs might not know at this time. Time will tell, but I still think Build 42 is going to be an incredible time for Zomboid, and hopefully we'll get some good, clear time frames for release in the coming months. Again, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one down in the comments below this video. Please do feel free to have a conversation with me or anyone else in the comments section. I think it's important that we talk about this and do so in an amicable way. Hopefully you didn't mind hearing me yap on about this for a little while. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, a very special thank you to my Patreon subscribers for supporting the channel, for joining our whitelisted Project Zomboid server for just £3 a month, and helping us to commission our own mods and maps that go into our themed server wipes every single month. Thanks folks, and I will see you all in the next one.